Hello, thank you for being here. I know we are in the final runway of the conference, and it's been quite interesting. So I'm a senior mediator with the Consensus Building Institute, and we are a nonprofit that helps people negotiate and builds the theory of negotiation. And we have 10 senior folks working around the country, around the world, actually. And I'm going to talk about the role of negotiating agricultural representation and groundwater sustainability in the California context of the new law that has been a high focus of the conference. And I'm going to draw on contributions from John Christ, who's right here in the audience, from his experience in Ventura County, which is in Southern California. A colleague, Tito, who is a very prominent agriculture person in agriculture in Sonoma County, as well as the theory and lessons learned, and tell a few stories along the way. The way I'm gonna focus my talk is to start with a few, walk through some challenges and some ways to negotiate and navigate through those challenges. And then I'll end with sort of some broader thinking on negotiation theory. So one of the big challenges for agriculture in groundwater sustainability is figuring out how to represent agricultural interests, because in many communities, agriculture is quite diverse. And the Salinas Valley, there's a lot of people I know running around the conference who work or live in the Salinas Valley, and I think it's very illustrative of this challenge, which is that when the Consensus Building Institute came in to do an assessment, a stakeholder issue assessment, to help them think about how to negotiate groundwater sustainability, identifying their representatives, what emerged was that there was so much diversity within ag across the entire basin, which is so large. It's like a large geographic swath of land. Crop type was also, there was row crops, grapes, different kinds of crops. And then the operations, where you have people who are growers, you've got labor, you've got packagers who wash the lettuce and put it in a bag that we all eat. And then you've got people who ship that stuff out and do the marketing. So the way they structured their representation on the GSA formation was to have the 3 trade associations represented, there's a leadership group of the large growers, and so the representative from that entity also came as a person with a very high level of credibility. Because the stakeholder issue assessment identified grape growing in the south part of the valley as a significant, having a significant role in water demand, we identified a grape grower. And then berries has a sort of a different type of water supply suite of issues. And so, and they tend to be not solely, but primarily located in the northern part of the valley, where there's a different sort of dynamic around groundwater supply. And so we have a berry person from the north. All of this was influenced by the stakeholder issue assessment that the Consensus Building Institute did, as well as the Groundwater Agricultural Caucus, which is where all of these ag entities come together and they help to figure out the representation for themselves and have continued to meet to think about their negotiation strategy. Another challenge that I think is prevalent in this work is when there is lack of a groundwater sustainability agency. I'm sorry, I can't say it. When there is not an agency that's eligible to serve as a groundwater sustainability agency that represents ag or has the trust of ag. And so an example of this is occurring right now in Sonoma County, which is just north of the San Francisco Bay. They have a long history of really active, proactive, non-regulatory groundwater management in this area. And there was no, in one of the basins around the Santa Rosa Plain, it's called the Santa Rosa Plain, there was no special district, no irrigation district to represent agriculture. And agriculture did not feel that the county could represent its interest. And so there has been multiple efforts that's still underway to sort through this, but the options are that they could create a special district via state legislation, which many water districts and irrigation districts in the state of California have been created through state legislation. The other thing, and they tried that and it failed. The second thing that they're considering now is forming an agency through LAFCO, which is a local agency formation commission. And the simplest way I know how to explain that is that it is a body that helps create transparency around creating public bodies, public agencies. So they're thinking about pursuing that. Within the same county, though, and they have 3 basins that are required to comply with the new law. There was a dormant irrigation district. So this is quite interesting. When the staff went to research what GSA eligible agencies might be in existence, there was the North Bay Water District, which was formed 50 years ago and never has been active, but the board of directors have kept it alive by having their board meeting and elections. And so that has now been dusted off and is now serving as a vehicle in 2 basins in this county as a representation for ag. And then the fourth option is to work through the resource conservation districts. And the state of California is now in the process of certifying who is GSA eligible. And in this county, in this particular basin, they have deemed the Resource Conservation District, or RCDs is what we mostly call them, as GSA eligible. So I think it's just there's different vehicles to pursue, and so these are some of the options that, that folks can think about. So I want to spend a little bit of time about the importance, if you are representing ag, how to keep your board on board, right? Many of you go into these situations where you're trying to negotiate groundwater sustainability, and you may have a board who really maybe isn't that flexible in their approach, or may not really want you to have a lot of problem-solving sessions with others, and to kind of give away the company store. And what I've heard is the story, and the challenge here is that when people come together to try to work out these issues, when the representative goes back to tell the board what they've agreed to, the person's like on the verge of being fired or kicked out because the board can't believe that's what they've agreed to. And so some of the tools that one can use in order to support keeping your board abreast and bringing them along with the negotiations on groundwater sustainability are to develop a range and a trading zone, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, with your board, so that so that the representative has sort of this range of acceptability to negotiate with others. Be very clear with your board on the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And then look for opportunities to create shared value with other partners, and not make it an us versus them, but try to figure out where you have some common ground or common interest that you can forge together as a whole. And then conducting regular briefings, keep coming back to your board to keep them abreast of the changes and the ideas that are being discussed, so that they come along with you in the negotiations. And then the other tool I think that can really help with keeping your board on board is to enlist the support of other ag leaders. If you are working where there's multiple ag representatives or others who have influence with your board, to really consider thinking about that and bringing them into the conversation with your board members. So just to delve into a couple of these in more detail. So this is a schematic of the trading zone, or this, I also like to reference this as a range of acceptability. And you have sort of these boundaries of your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So what happens if we don't reach an agreement? That's sort of these outer bars. But it's these circles and everything in between where you have this opportunity for creativity and good thinking. And so, what's great for me and good for you. That's the idea. You're trying to create value and think about how you can best work with others. And also what's great for you and good for me. Those are still things, outcomes that could be acceptable. So this concept, many of you have probably heard of the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And the intent here is to help you and your organization or your ag colleagues or ags as an interest group to think about what's the cost of agreeing, right? Like, what is the risk associated with making this agreement on groundwater sustainability? And under SGMA, the alternative is not that great, right? I mean, the alternative is the state board is going to intervene, which is going to cost more and usually if there's one thing I can get people to agree on as a mediator, that the state is worse than almost anything people can agree on. So that's often a common ground when you have nothing else. And then the other thing that I've learned through this conference is that in some areas where I'm working, I've heard rumors that people think, oh, we'll try to work it out, but if not, we're just going to adjudicate the basin. Well, what I learned at this conference is that's not even a way out, because even if with an adjudicated basin, they still have to meet the requirements of SGMA. So really, the way SGMA has been written, it's you either figure it out now or you figure it out later, but you've got to work it out eventually. So I think this is a really important point for keeping your board on board, is to understand that there's not a lot of good options and alternatives to your negotiated agreement. So how many of you have had this experience? Sometimes I think the collaborative process would work better without you. I mean, I'm a mediator and I feel like this often, occasionally anyway. So I think the other thing to think about if you're looking for representation and trying to negotiate your role in decision making is to really think about who is a good representative. And these are just some qualities here that I listed around an effective negotiator, problem solver, somebody who can listen and really forge some type of agreements. And when I say collaborative, I don't mean a pushover. I mean somebody who's flexible and creative. And I have a good story here where I've been working with a person who's is representing ag. And they were getting into having a lot of conflict over how to contribute the startup funding for the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And the dormant irrigation district that I mentioned earlier really doesn't have a lot of assets. They don't have any revenue, so they don't really want to contribute seed money for the Groundwater Agency. And on the other hand, I've got a city who's the only city in this basin, and they want weighted voting or some type of veto because they don't want all of these outside entities forcing them, like overruling them in the voting process. So, we kind of hit a standstill, took a break for a couple weeks and come back, and the ag representative comes in and he says, well, I've changed my mind. I'm willing to allow you, city, to have your veto. And for the supermajority, I understand you have to you have to sign off on the agreement. And so it's kind of a veto. That's just shorthand for what it is. But he said, but in exchange for those special voting privileges, I'm going to ask that you guarantee all the loans that the GSA is going to need in the startup phase. So that's an example of where he is a very creative negotiator. He's a great representative. He listened to what the city needed and came back to them and said, okay, city, you can have what you need, but here's what I need too. And no one walked, and they're all evaluating the option right now. So the other thing that I think is really important in the representation is to think about the follow-through and the selection process for the governing board. So if you're negotiating an ag representative, then think about in 10 years when we're not around and we don't know anyone on this governing board, how do we secure that we're going to have an effective ag representative who has credibility for the governing board? And so drawing from Ventura County as an example, what one of their GSAs is doing is that they go to the Farm Bureau, and the Farm Bureau puts forward 3 names, and then the governing board of the GSA will then pick one of those 3 names to serve in that seat. But the key here is to get that information into the formation documents, so when you're long gone or there's a whole new slew of people in there, that it's part of the agreement how the ag representatives are going to be selected. So the last thing I just want to touch on is developing a sort of a broader negotiation strategy. And I think one of the things that you can do is try to work together to advance your negotiation strategy across agriculture or within agriculture, however you think about it. And I think one of the great tools there is to continue meeting as a caucus and help each other think strategically about your choices. And then another piece, I think, is to think about how can you develop partnerships with folks that you might traditionally think of as enemies, And a great example of this that I'm waiting for it to unfold is in another area where environmentalists have a lot of political play in this basin. And as does agriculture. It's a very prominent, dynamic, important ag economy. And so both ag and the environmentalists want a seat on the governing board of the agency. And they want a very active role in crafting the plan down the road for sustainability. But what I'm waiting to have happen is environmentalists have just made very prominent their interests because they wrote a letter outlining their goal of serving on the board. And ag has been very active on it too. So what I'm waiting to have happen is for agriculture reps and the environmental reps to come together in this basin and go to the county and say, county, we don't think it's okay to just have the GSA eligible agencies on this board any longer. We think that we both need a seat. And I think that will be, if that happens, I think that will shift the dynamic significantly, and I think both ag and environmentalists will get what they like. I can't imagine, I find it really hard to believe that the elected officials will stand strong. So that's an example that none of those folks are in the room, which is good, but that I could foresee that happening in the very near term. And so that's an example of working together and figuring out, how can you advance yourselves together rather than always separating. And I don't know why this keeps getting funky on this slide, but this is just sort of an overarching view of the negotiation theory that I'm referencing on negotiating for mutual gain. And it's really around preparing, which I touched on, which is figuring out how you represent your interest, how you keep your board on board, how do you identify your representative who can negotiate effectively on your behalf, and then how can you work with your partners and with others that you might not even consider as your allies to create value for both your interest as well as theirs. And then lastly is to think about the longer term follow through on these issues, what you're setting up now, and I missed an early slide just because of the funkiness here, but to think about how you secure your selection process into the future, and the decisions that you're contributing to now for the GSA formation are really the decisions that are going to affect governing once the governing board is in place, and it's going to affect the plan development, because securing that representation in the decision-making process is what's really going to support all of you into the long term in contributing to the groundwater sustainability plans and achieving sustainability. So that is it. Thank you.